The paper trembled in my hands, not because I was afraid, but because I was furious. I had been holding this particular fury for exactly 11 days. 11 days since Oliver Snyder had walked into the quarterly department meeting, sat directly across from me, and opened his mouth to say the words that would set the next chapter of my life spinning completely off its axis. 11 days since he had looked at every person in that conference room except me and announced with the kind of casual certainty that only alphas of his rank seemed to possess, that the Omega staff members of the Meridian Analytics Division would be better served working from a separate floor. Better served. I had written those two words at the top of the HR complaint form in capital letters, underlined them twice. My name is Mario Small. I am 26 years old, a certified data analyst, and a secondary gender designation of Omega. Though I have never, not once in my professional career, allowed that last fact to determine how I was treated in a workspace. I had fought too hard for that. Graduated in the top 3% of my cohort. Turned down 2 offers at firms where the Omega accommodations were, frankly, insulting. Small rooms with thin walls and air fresheners that smelled like someone had tried to bottle synthetic calm. I chose Meridian because their secondary designation policy was, on paper, one of the most progressive in the sector. On paper. Oliver Snyder was 32, head of strategic development, the kind of alpha whose mere presence in a hallway caused other people to unconsciously readjust their posture. I had noticed that about him the first week I joined the company, noticed it with the detached clinical interest of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to identify power dynamics before they could be used against him. He was tall, in the way that felt deliberate, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that didn't miss much and a scent, even suppressed by the regulation blockers all alpha executives were required to wear, that sat at the edge of your awareness like a low, persistent chord. I had done an excellent job of not finding him attractive. Past tense, because finding him attractive was now the last thing on my mind. I smoothed the complaint form against my desk, picked up my pen, and continued writing. The HR department at Meridian occupied half of the 14th floor, sandwiched between legal and the executive washrooms. The woman who received my form, Diane, according to her nameplate with reading glasses pushed up into silver-streaked hair, looked at the form, looked at me, and then looked at the form again with the expression of someone who had just found an unexpected item in a usually peaceful grocery bag. "Mr. Small," she began. "The form is complete," I told her. Section 3, subsection B, workplace discrimination on the basis of secondary designation. I've cited the company's own accommodation policy, the regional equal designation statutes, and attached the meeting transcript I recorded on my phone. It's all legal. I checked. Diane blinked. "You recorded the meeting." "I record all company meetings. It's in my employment contract that I may do so for professional development purposes." I had added that clause myself during negotiation. The hiring manager had seemed mildly baffled by the request at the time. I was very glad now that I had insisted. She accepted the form. I thanked her, walked back to my desk on the 11th floor, and sat down with the particular calm of someone who has just pulled the pin on a grenade and is waiting to hear the sound. The sound came 4 days later in the form of a calendar invitation. Mediation session. M. Small, O. Snyder. Conference room 7B, 10:30 a.m. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I accepted the invitation, blocked the hour before it for preparation, and went to make myself a coffee. Conference room 7B was smaller than I expected. A round table, 6 chairs, a window that looked out over the gray geometric sprawl of the business district. An HR mediator named Patrick, who had the careful, practiced neutrality of a man who had talked too many people down from too many ledges, was already seated when I arrived. He gestured to a chair. Oliver Snyder arrived exactly on time. This surprised me. I had expected him to be late, in the subtle way that powerful people sometimes were late, not enough to be cited, just enough to remind you of the hierarchy. But he walked in at precisely 10 o'clock, set a leather portfolio on the table, and sat down across from me without looking at anything in the room except, immediately and directly, my face. I had prepared for many things. I had not prepared for him to look at me like he was seeing me for the first time and finding it significant. "Mr. Small," Patrick began, "thank you both for being here. This is an informal mediation. Nothing said in this room is admissible in any formal proceedings unless both parties agree. The goal today is to open a dialogue and, ideally, reach a resolution." I kept my eyes on Patrick and gave a single nod. "Mr. Snyder," Patrick continued, "you've reviewed Mr. Small's complaint?" "I have." Oliver's voice was lower in person than it was in meetings. I had not noticed that before. "I want to begin by saying that the proposal I made was poorly worded, and I take full responsibility for that." I turned to look at him then, because that was not what I had expected. "Poorly worded," I repeated. He met my gaze steadily. "The intent was to designate a specific floor as a full accommodation space, enhanced air filtration, private rooms, flexible scheduling for cycle management. The implementation team had already been briefed. I didn't communicate that context in the meeting, and I understand why the announcement, taken alone, sounded like segregation." I studied him for a moment. Something in me, the part that had been angry for 15 days, was recalibrating rapidly, and I did not especially enjoy the sensation. "That context," I said carefully, "was not present in the meeting. No, it wasn't. That was my failure." Patrick was watching us both with the expression of a man who had prepared for a much longer afternoon and was cautiously revising his timeline. "The accommodation floor," I said. "Was it optional?" Oliver paused. "It wasn't specified as such in the briefing materials. That's another oversight." "So the announcement sounded mandatory." "Yes." I set my pen down on the notepad I had brought. "Mr. Probin, Snyder, I want to be clear about something. The issue was never whether the accommodations themselves were appropriate. Enhanced facilities for Omegas during high-stress cycles are a legitimate support. The issue was the framing, that Omega employees would be better served separately, as though our presence in the standard workspace was somehow in need of management. Do you understand the distinction?" He looked at me for a long, quiet moment, long enough that Patrick shifted slightly in his chair. "Yes," Oliver said, "I do. Good." I picked my pen back up. "Then I'd like to suggest the following resolution. The accommodation floor is redesignated as a voluntary, opt-in resource available to any employee regardless of secondary designation, including betas and alphas who may benefit from quieter, lower stimulation work environments. The language in the internal communications is reviewed and approved by at least one Omega employee before release, and a brief, mandatory awareness session for department heads covers designation-neutral language in professional settings." Patrick was writing rapidly. Oliver was still looking at me. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite categorize, not the defensiveness I had expected, not the polished corporate contrition I had braced for. Something more like attention, real attention, the kind that landed differently than the reflexive regard most people gave you. "Those are reasonable proposals," he said. "I'll support all three." And just like that, the mediation that I had spent 15 days preparing for was over in 40 minutes. Patrick gathered his notes with the quiet satisfaction of a man who would be done by lunch. I capped my pen. Oliver closed his portfolio. We both stood at approximately the same time, and for one brief, strange moment, we were standing on the same side of the round table because we had both moved to leave by the same door, and the space between us was much smaller than a conference room had any business producing. His scent, even through the blockers, was there at the edges, something dark and clean, like night air near cedar. My own suppressants were excellent. I had been on a high-dose prescription since I was 19, and my scent was, by all accounts, nearly undetectable to most alphas. Most. Oliver Snyder's nostrils moved, very slightly, in the way that alphas sometimes couldn't help, even when they were trying to be professional, and his gaze dropped to my face for just a fraction of a second too long. I walked out of conference room 7B first. In the elevator down to my floor, I stood with my back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and did a very honest inventory of the last 40 minutes. I had gone in expecting resistance, or performative contrition, or the particular brand of alpha defensiveness that presented itself as reasonableness, while fundamentally not yielding an inch. I had gone in prepared for a fight that would need to escalate beyond mediation, and I had already drafted a mental outline for the next steps if Patrick's session produced nothing. What I had not been prepared for was being agreed with clearly, immediately, and without qualification. The elevator opened. I stepped out onto the 11th floor and walked to my desk with the slightly disoriented feeling of someone who had trained for a marathon and been handed the finish line at the first corner. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I did not think about Oliver Snyder's expression in the last moment before I walked out the door, that focused, attentive thing that had no corporate language around it. I absolutely did not think about that. How did it go? Priya appeared beside my desk with the timing of someone who had been watching the elevator. It resolved. That's it? It just resolved? He acknowledged the framing error, agreed to all 3 of my proposed corrections, and the whole thing took 40 minutes. Priya sat down in her chair slowly. Mario, what? He just agreed with the complaint that you filed against him. That is what I said. She was quiet for a moment in the way she sometimes was when she was processing something that didn't fit her existing model. Okay, she said finally. So you won. I didn't win, I said. The outcome I wanted was an equitable workplace. That outcome appears to be forthcoming. It isn't winning when the correct thing happens. It's just the correct thing happening. You can be pleased about it. I am satisfied, I said, which was true. What I did not say, because I was not ready to examine it closely enough to put into words, was that I was also something else. Something smaller and less categorized. Something that had to do with a man who had looked at me across a round table and said, without preamble, I was wrong, and had meant it. 3 weeks after the mediation, I was assigned to the cross-divisional analytics project that Oliver Snyder was heading. I considered, briefly, whether to request a reassignment. I spent approximately 90 seconds on this consideration before dismissing it. I was the most qualified analyst on the available roster for the project's specific requirements. Requesting a reassignment would signal that the mediation had left something unresolved between us, and it had not. We had reached an agreement. We were professionals. Everything was completely fine. The dataset is enormous, said Priya, my desk neighbor and the closest thing I had to a work friend, peering over my shoulder at the project brief. Cross-referencing 3 years of market data across 4 regional branches. That's going to be months of work. 4 to 6 months based on the scope. You'll be working directly with Snyder's team. Primarily with his team's data leads, I said. I don't anticipate much direct interaction with Snyder himself. Priya looked at me in the way she sometimes did. The way that suggested she had an opinion she was choosing not to share because she valued our friendship enough to let me figure certain things out on my own. Sure, she said pleasantly, very little direct interaction. She was, of course, completely right, and I was, of course, not going to tell her that. The first project meeting had 12 people in it. Oliver sat at the head of the table. I sat midway down the left side. He walked through the project structure methodically, with the kind of organized competence that was, objectively speaking, useful in a project lead. He called on people by name. He asked questions that indicated he had actually read the background documents. He remembered that the analyst from the Eastern branch had a scheduling conflict on Fridays and adjusted the meeting cadence without being asked. I took notes. I contributed 3 observations in the first hour that substantively improved the proposed data segmentation framework. Oliver incorporated all 3 without pausing to make a production of it, which I respected. After the meeting, as people gathered their things, he stopped beside my chair. The segmentation idea, he said quietly, in a tone that didn't carry to the others filtering out around us. Using the acquisition date as a secondary sort key rather than the entry date. I hadn't thought of that. It's better. The entry date creates noise from delayed processing, I said. Acquisition gives you a cleaner baseline. I know. That's why it's better. A pause. Thank you. I looked up at him. He was closer than he had been in the conference room. The table was narrower here, and he had leaned against the edge of it in the easy, unconscious way that people with long legs sometimes did when a chair was inconvenient. The blockers were doing their job. He wasn't doing anything wrong. There was simply, undeniably, a quality to his presence that my nervous system had apparently decided to register. "You're welcome," I said. He nodded and straightened. I gathered my notepad and left. That night, I went home to my apartment, fed my cat, a gray tabby named Claus. After a professional term I had found unexpectedly funny when I was 22, and sat on my sofa for a while without turning on any lights. I was not in a heat cycle. I was in complete neurological and hormonal equilibrium, as confirmed by my last checkup 2 months prior. My suppressants were up to date. Everything was fine. The problem was that my body had apparently not received sufficient memo regarding Oliver Snyder. I picked Claus up, set him on my lap, and very deliberately thought about literally anything else. The second month of the project brought a complication in the form of the Eastern Branch data, which had been formatted inconsistently across 3 fiscal years and required a week of manual reconciliation before any analysis was possible. Oliver called a problem-solving session, just the 4 most senior analysts, plus himself, and we spent an entire afternoon around a whiteboard drawing data flow diagrams and arguing about methodology. I found, in that session, that Oliver argued well. He was not the kind of person who dug in out of pride. When someone presented a better approach, he shifted to it cleanly, without the performance of reluctance that I had seen from other executives who needed the transition to feel like their own idea. But he also pushed back when he had reason to, and his reasons were specific and technical rather than hierarchical. He never once said anything that translated to, "Because I'm the project lead." He said things like, "The problem with that approach is the edge case at year-end rollover," and then waited for someone to address the edge case. I addressed the edge case as it happened. At length, we disagreed for 20 minutes and arrived at a hybrid solution that was neither my approach nor his original one. And at the end of it, he nodded once and wrote it on the whiteboard in the particular crisp hand of someone who had been taught to print clearly and had kept the habit. "You write like an architect," I said. He looked at the whiteboard, then at me. A brief, surprised beat. My father, he was an engineer. I used to do homework at his drafting table. It was a small thing, a fragment of a person offered without calculation. I filed it, and then noticed I was filing it, which told me something I was going to have to think about later. The project ran for 5 months. In that time, I had, let me count, far more direct interactions with Oliver Snyder than I had anticipated. This was, in retrospect, somewhat inevitable, given that I was the senior analyst on a project he was directly leading, and that the data complexity repeatedly threw up problems that required the 2 of us to work through together. We ate lunch at our desks twice a week and called it a working lunch so no one could accuse us of choosing it. He drank his coffee black and too hot, which struck me as stubbornness disguised as preference. I drank mine with a precise amount of oat milk, and he never commented on this even though I caught him watching me add it once with an expression I chose not to analyze. He was not what I had built in my head during the 15 days of my complaint. He was sharper, yes, sharp enough that keeping up with him required me to be fully present in every conversation, which I found both irritating and stimulating in a way I was not going to examine. But he was also quieter than the alpha archetype I had assigned him. He did not fill rooms with his presence deliberately. He simply took up the space he needed and no more. He asked for what he wanted directly and listened when people said no. When someone on the project team made an error, he identified it without performance and moved on. There was one afternoon, 7 weeks into the project, when we were working late, just the 2 of us as it happened, because the rest of the team had left, and neither of us had noticed the time until the cleaners knocked on the door of the small meeting room we had taken over. He had jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, looking at a data visualization on my laptop that I was trying to get to represent what I needed it to represent. It's the axis scale, he said, leaning over me to point at the screen. If you logarithmic the y-axis, the trend pattern becomes visible. I know what a logarithmic scale is. I know you know. I glanced up. He was very close. Close enough that the collar of his shirt was in my peripheral vision, and the dark wood smell of him was not blocked enough, not quite, not at this proximity. My pulse did something I firmly declined to acknowledge. I was going to do it, I said. I was building to it. You were catastrophizing the visual first. You do that. You work through all the ways something is wrong before you fix it. I turned to face him properly, which was perhaps not the wisest decision given the angle. You've noticed a pattern in how I work. He met my eyes without flinching. I pay attention to people I work with. To all people you work with? The question hung there longer than it should have. Something shifted in the air between us. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just a small and undeniable shift. The way a key turns in a lock without making any sound and still opens everything. Go home, Mario, he said. His voice had dropped half a register. We've been in this room for 4 hours. My name? He had used my first name, without preface, without anything, and it landed in my chest in a place I had not given him permission to land. I closed the laptop. Good night, Mr. Snyder. Oliver, he said. Just that. Just his name, offered without expectation, and I felt it follow me all the way down to the lobby. My suppressants failed in March. I want to be clear about the sequence of events because it matters. My prescription had run without incident for 7 years. I had never, not once, missed a dose or had a significant hormonal spike. My body was, as my doctor had cheerfully put it, very well managed. What happened in March was the result of a batch inconsistency in the pharmacy's supply. Something I did not know at the time, something that my body registered before my mind caught up. I noticed, on a Monday morning, that my coffee tasted strange. Not bad, just different. Too sharp at the edges, too vivid. Priya's perfume was louder than usual. The fluorescent light above my desk hummed at a frequency I didn't remember it having. By 11 o'clock, I was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the office temperature, and by 11:30, I knew exactly what was happening. I sent a single message to my manager, migraine, working from home, and began gathering my things with the brisk, controlled urgency of someone managing a situation. My suppressant backup pack was in my desk drawer. I had always kept one there. I took the pills immediately, knowing it would take at least 4 to 6 hours for them to level out what had already begun. I did not, under any circumstances, want to be in the office for the next 4 to 6 hours. I almost made it. Almost. The elevator opened on the ground floor, and Oliver Snyder was standing in the lobby, jacket over his arm, clearly about to head out for a meeting. He saw me immediately. Of course he did. His eyes went to my face, then to my general bearing, the 2 bright eyes, the flush I could feel on my cheeks, and his expression did something complicated. Mario. Not a question, not an exclamation. Just my name, deployed with careful precision, and I appreciated the precision even as I wanted to walk past it. I'm going home, I said. Suppressant issue, completely managed. I've taken the backup dose. He set his jacket down on a lobby chair. The backup takes hours. I know how my own biology works, thank you. I know you do. He stepped toward me, not in the purposeful way of an alpha following a scent, I want to be clear about that, but in the way of a man who has made a considered decision and is acting on it. My car is out front. My driver is discreet. Let me take you home. That's not... Mario? His voice was quiet and steady. You are in the beginning of an unmanaged heat cycle in the lobby of our office building. Let me take you home. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds. My body was doing things I had not signed off on, and the worst part was that being near him was not helping. Being near him was in fact making the suppressant struggle considerably harder because he smelled like, because his scent was, because my hindbrain, the part I had successfully kept in a very small and well-labeled box for 7 years, was currently staging a comprehensive revolt. Fine, I said. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with zero ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. His car was a deep navy, interior clean and quiet. His driver, a small, composed woman named Esther, who gave no indication that anything about the situation was unusual, pulled into traffic with calm efficiency. Oliver sat beside me in the back seat with a deliberate 6 inches of distance between us, which I noted, and which I also noted was costing him something. Because alphas near omegas in the early stages of a heat weren't supposed to find it easy, and he was doing it anyway. You don't have to, I started. I want to. Silence. The city moved past the window. Why? I asked. He turned to look at me. In the low, flat light of the overcast morning, his face was careful and open at once, and I thought that this was perhaps the most honest I had ever seen him, more honest than the mediation, more honest than the late evenings over data, and what I found there was something I had not been looking for and could not now unsee. Because I pay attention, he said. To you, specifically, not only as a person I work with. My chest was doing something I was no longer going to claim was purely physiological. This is, I said, a very inopportune time to be telling me that. Yes, a ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. I know. Esther pulled up to my building. I thanked her. Oliver walked me to my door. Just the lobby. He stopped at the lobby, which was the right call, and the one I would have insisted on. Except that when I turned to say goodbye, he was looking at me with an expression that dismantled something I had been very carefully maintaining for months. Call someone, he said. Don't be alone for this if you don't have to be. I have Claus, R-U-T. The cat. He is an excellent heat companion, non-judgmental. Warming. That got a real expression. A brief, unguarded thing that rearranged his whole face and made him look younger and warmer and far more dangerous to my current equilibrium. Okay, he said. Good. Call me if you need anything. I won't need anything. Call me anyway, he said, and walked back to the car. I stood in my lobby for a moment after he was gone. Then I went upstairs, curled up with Claus, and spent 3 days managing a heat cycle while thinking, against my very best efforts, about the shape of Oliver Snyder's unguarded smile. We did not address it immediately, because neither of us was the kind of person to do things before we were ready. The project ran 2 more months. We worked together with the same focused professionalism we had always had, and if there was now an additional charge to the silences, a new awareness to the way we sometimes found ourselves standing closer than the task required. Neither of us named it. I had been named things my whole life, designated, categorized, assessed, and I was not going to rush something I had no framework for yet, but something had changed. I was honest enough with myself to admit that. He brought me coffee once, precisely the right amount of oat milk, without comment, and set it at my elbow as he was passing. I did not look up from my screen. I said, "Thank you, Oliver," and I heard the slight pause in his step before he continued walking, and I allowed myself exactly one small, private feeling about the whole exchange. The project ended on a Friday in May. We had a team celebration in one of the larger conference rooms, catered, which meant decent sandwiches and a cake with the company logo on it that nobody ate except the junior analyst who had been with us since month 2 and had the enthusiasm of someone still on the right side of first disillusionment. Oliver gave a brief, good speech about the team's work. He cited specific contributions from specific people, including mine, without flourish but with genuine precision, and I watched the faces of the people around the table do that thing faces do when they feel actually seen. When the room thinned out, I was the second to last to leave. Oliver was staying to clear the remnants with an efficiency that I suspected had more to do with not wanting to hand it to the cleaners than anything else. I picked up my notepad, a habit I maintained even when meetings were purely social, and paused at the door. "Good project," I said. He looked up from the table. It was. "You're a good project lead." He studied me. "That sounds like it took something from you." It required a complete reversal of my initial assessment. I prefer to be right the first time. And the first time you assessed me, he said, setting down the stack of plates he'd been gathering. What was the verdict? Privileged. Careless with language, the kind of alpha who doesn't notice what he doesn't notice. Fair. And then you showed up on time to a mediation you could have sent your legal team to. I held my notepad against my chest. And you said your proposal was poorly worded before I even finished my opening. And then 5 months of being in rooms with you, and I kept having to update the file. He was very still. What's in the file now? I looked at him across the empty conference room. The half-eaten cake on the side table, the late afternoon light coming in at an angle through the blinds. And I thought about the lobby in March, and the coffee with the right amount of milk, and my name said the right way, by the right voice, at the right frequency. Something I don't have a professional classification for, I said. He crossed the room. Not rushed, not dramatically, just walked toward me with the same purposeful steadiness he brought to everything, and stopped close enough that I would have had to take a deliberate step back to create distance. And I did not take a step back. Mario, he said, I would like to take you to dinner, not as a project lead, not as anything professional, just as myself. I looked up at him. You should know, I said, that I am a complicated person to be involved with. I have strong opinions about workplace fairness. I record meetings. I filed a formal complaint against you. I know. And I was right to. You were completely right to. He said this simply, without defensiveness, and meant it. I would like to take you to dinner anyway. I breathed in and out. Saturday, I said. 7 o'clock. I'll send you the restaurant. It's a place I like, so I'm choosing it. I would expect nothing less. He was, it turned out, someone I could talk to. This was not a given. I had dated, not often, but I had. And the consistent challenge had been the particular loneliness of being smart and structured in rooms with people who found both qualities impressive from a distance and inconvenient up close. People who wanted my analysis until it disagreed with their instinct. People who were attracted to my competence until it meant I noticed when they were wrong. One person, in particular, 2 years ago, an architect named Dominic who had seemed promising for the first 4 months and then systematically resented every position I held with more certainty than his, had left me with a careful wariness around early attraction that I had not entirely dismantled since. Oliver was different in a way I kept waiting to discover was a performance and kept failing to catch the edge of. The first dinner was at the restaurant I chose. A small place with good bread and better wine, where the tables were close enough together that you had to speak quietly. He arrived before me, which I had not expected, and had already spoken to the host and been seated. He was looking at the menu when I walked in, and looked up when I approached, and stood, not with the excess formality of someone performing manners, just the natural rising of someone who is genuinely pleased you've arrived. You're early, I said, sitting across from him. So are you, he observed. We were both 15 minutes early to our own dinner. I looked at him. He had the expression of someone who found this information delightful rather than embarrassing, and I decided, in that moment, that this was going to be more complicated than I had braced for. We talked for 3 hours. About work. Not specifically our shared project, but the broader question of what data could and couldn't tell you. Which turned out to be the kind of conversation that had no natural ending because the question kept generating new ones. About what we'd studied. About the things we'd gotten wrong early in our careers and what the errors had cost us. He told me about a risk assessment he had authorized in his second year at Meridian that, in retrospect, had been overconfident in the model and underprepared for variance, a project that had cost the company a meaningful amount of money and had cost him a great deal of sleep. I didn't ask enough questions, he said. I came in as an alpha in a senior role, and I had not yet properly learned, that confidence in the room doesn't mean correctness in the model. What made you learn it? A junior analyst who was 23 years old told me, with complete politeness and absolute clarity, that my variance assumption was off. He paused. I pushed back initially. I was wrong too. When the project resolved and the data supported her position, I went to find her and apologized. She is now heading a team in the Western branch. I turned my wine glass slowly. You remember her? Of course. She was right. I try to remember when people are right. There was a version of me 2 years ago who would have been cataloging each of these disclosures for evidence of performance, looking for the seam where sincerity became strategy, where the carefully constructed reasonable alpha presentation would reveal the calculation beneath. I was looking for that seam now, I noticed, and I kept not finding it, which was its own kind of evidence. After dinner, we walked for a while in the way that people sometimes do when neither party is ready for the evening to end, but neither has named that yet. The city at night was loud and blurred at the edges with light. He walked beside me at a pace that matched mine rather than pulling ahead, which sounds minor and wasn't. Tell me something outside of work, he said. I cook, I said, seriously. Not as a hobby, as a practice. There's a form to it that satisfies the same part of me that data analysis does, a problem, a methodology, a result. What do you cook? Anything that requires technique. Pasta from scratch, bread, stock that takes 8 hours because anything less is not stock, it's colored water. He laughed, quiet, genuine. 8-hour stock. Don't be dismissive of the stock. I'm not. I'm impressed by the commitment. A pause. I can't cook. At all. I can make eggs, reliably. Everything else is aspirational. That's fixable, I said, and then heard myself say it and understood, with a quality of clarity that was either unwelcome or overdue, that I was offering to fix it. That I was, in the syntax of the conversation, suggesting a future where I would stand in a kitchen with this man and show him how to cook something that wasn't eggs. He heard it too. He didn't make anything of it, didn't pull on the thread, just let it exist there in the evening air between us, available for later. I would like that, he said simply. We said goodnight at the corner of my street. He did not try to walk me further, did not press for anything, just stood there in the streetlight with his hands in his coat pockets looking at me. Saturday was good, I said. It was. He had that careful attention again, the kind that made me feel seen rather than assessed. Same time next week? I looked at him. The city hummed around us. Claus was waiting at home, unimpressed and hungry. The very first version of the evening had begun with me choosing a restaurant because I intended to maintain control of at least that much. And somewhere in the bread and the wine and the 8-hour stock and a young analyst in the Western branch, something had shifted and I had not stopped it. Next week, I said, I'll cook. He was, it turned out, someone I could talk to. He had opinions. They were formed and specific, and he held them clearly, and when I disagreed, which was often, we had very different starting assumptions about risk modeling, which was professionally irrelevant and personally fascinating. He engaged rather than retreated. He would say, that's wrong, here's why, and I would say, that's also wrong, here's why. And we would go back and forth until one of us conceded the point, or we found a synthesis that neither of us had started with, and both outcomes felt like winning something. He made me laugh. I had not expected that. He was dry and specific in his humor, the kind that rewarded paying attention, and the first time I laughed, actually laughed. Surprised out of my composure by something he said about the cake at the project party, he looked at me with an expression of such genuine pleasure that I had to look away. There was a night, 3 weeks in, when we had dinner at my apartment because I had been the one to cook, and I was a better cook than I usually admitted. He was sitting on my kitchen counter, not a chair, not a bar stool, the actual counter, which meant he had been comfortable enough to stop being architecturally correct, watching me plate the food, and he said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone at work." I set a plate in front of him. I almost didn't become an analyst. What would you have become? A violinist. I set it to my own plate, to the food, not to him. I was good enough for conservatory. I got in, and then I did the math on the economics of it, and I didn't go. Do you regret it? I looked up. Some days, less than I expected to, more than I let myself admit. A pause. What about you? He turned his wine glass slowly. I almost didn't take the promotion to strategic development. Why not? Because the previous head of the division was my mentor. He died 8 months before the position was offered to me, and every time I sat in the chair behind his desk, it felt like stepping over something. He said it evenly, without performance of grief, which was somehow sadder than performance would have been. I still move his name plaque to the left of center where he kept it. The facilities team keeps centering it. I sat down across from him. Something in the evening had changed register, gone quieter and more real. "Oliver," I said. He looked at me. "I'm glad you took the promotion," I said, "so that I could file a complaint against you." He laughed. A real one, full and surprised, and I felt it in my sternum, which was where, I was increasingly understanding, he had been lodging himself for months. There was another evening. This was in the 4th week, I think. Time had developed a new texture. When we were walking back through a park near his apartment after dinner, and it started raining. Not dramatically, not a downpour. A persistent, medium rain that neither of us had thought to prepare for. He produced an umbrella from somewhere. Because of course he had an umbrella, he was the kind of person who carried one and held it above us both, which required him to walk closer than the sidewalk alone required. We walked like that for a while without discussing it. "You know," I said, "the mediation could have gone very differently." "How so?" "If you had been defensive. If you had sent legal. If you had done any of the things that powerful people tend to do when someone files a formal complaint against them." He was quiet for a moment. The rain pattered against the umbrella above our heads. "Was that what you expected?" "It was what I prepared for." "You prepared for a fight. I prepare for everything." A pause. "I had a 3-stage escalation plan." He glanced sideways at me. 3 stages. HR mediation, formal grievance procedure with external review, and if those failed, public disclosure through the appropriate regulatory channels. He stopped walking. I stopped too because the umbrella was stationary. "Mario," he said, and then again with something in it I couldn't parse, "Mario." "The policy was clear," I said. "And I had documentation." "I know." He was looking at me with the expression I was still learning, the one that was not categorizable, but that I had begun to associate with moments of significance, with things that were being filed somewhere important inside him. "I'm glad you did it. You're glad I filed a complaint against you. I'm glad you didn't let it go," he said. "I'm glad you were the kind of person who wouldn't let it go. I needed to be corrected. And I needed to see it happen the way you did it, which was without cruelty, without maximizing the damage, just with the clearest possible statement of what was wrong and what it would take to fix it." He looked ahead at the rain-blurred park. "That's not something everyone can do." I stood in the rain under his umbrella, in the small warm circle of shared air, and thought about 15 days of anger and a printed complaint form and capital letters underlined twice. About what it had cost me to do it. Not in terms of risk. I had calculated the risk carefully and found it acceptable. But in terms of the particular exhaustion of being the one who always had to insist. "It's tiring," I said, "being the one who documents things." He looked at me with complete attention. "It is," I said, "to always have to know your rights better than anyone else in the room. To have to prepare for 3 stages when one should be sufficient. To file the form knowing that half the people who see it will decide you're the problem before they've read the content." I held his gaze. "I don't say this to indict you specifically. I say it because you asked me to tell you something I hadn't told anyone at work, and this is what it is." He didn't say, "I'm sorry," which would have been insufficient. He didn't offer solutions, which would have been tone-deaf. He stood in the rain under the umbrella and looked at me as though what I had said was being received at full weight, and after a moment he said, quietly, "Thank you for telling me." That was, I thought, exactly the right response. That was, I thought, watching the rain. That night, when he walked me to the entrance of the park where our routes diverged, he stood facing me with the umbrella between us and said, "I would like to keep doing this, seeing you, whatever we're calling it." "We're not calling it anything yet," I said. "That's fine." He offered the umbrella. "Take this. I'll get a cab. You'll get soaked before you find a cab. I'll survive." I looked at him, rain beginning to touch his shoulders. I thought about 14 days of preparing for a fight that didn't come. about an umbrella and a park, and a man who had said thank you in exactly the right way. Split the cab, I said. He smiled. The real one, the unguarded one, the one I was already keeping for myself. Split the cab, he agreed. That was, I think, when I stopped looking for the seam. That was, I think, when I decided he was real. I have to tell you something, he said, very quietly. My heart did exactly one careful stutter. What? I have been in love with you since the mediation. The room was very still. Claus meowed. That was 8 months ago, I said. Yes. You've been in love with me for 8 months, and you said nothing. You had filed a complaint against me. It seemed like a bad time. I stared at him. And then, despite everything, despite my general policy on involuntary emotional expression, I laughed, properly helplessly in the way that only happens when something is both absurd and exactly right. And he watched me laugh with an expression that I now understood had a name, and that name was love, and I was going to have to update the file again. The test sat on my bathroom counter for 3 minutes while I stood in the hallway and looked at the wall. 4 months after the kitchen, after the kiss that was both of us and neither of us. 4 months after the conversation where we'd agreed, carefully, clearly, like two people who took things seriously, that we were in this, that we were not casual, that the word commitment was not one either of us used lightly, and we were using it. That conversation deserves its own account, because I do not want it to be a footnote. We had been seeing each other for 3 months when he came over on a Sunday, something that had become a pattern Sunday afternoons at my apartment. Claus, imperiously occupying the center of the sofa, and instead of reaching for the book he'd brought or the wine I had already opened, he sat on the edge of the coffee table facing me and said, "Without preamble, I want to talk about what this is." I had been waiting for this, not with dread, more with the careful attention of someone who has identified an important data point approaching. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "I think it's something I take seriously." He was choosing his words with the same care he brought to presentations, not performing care, actually exercising it, which meant he had been thinking about this before he arrived. "I think you're someone I want to plan things around, not as an afterthought, as a first consideration." I looked at him sitting on my coffee table, blocking the lamp, completely comfortable in my space, in the way he had become, without either of us announcing it. Claus was on his left knee. Oliver had one hand on the cat's back and did not appear to notice this was happening. "I don't do things casually," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't want something that might not be what it looks like. I've done that before, I won't do it again." "I know." He met my eyes steadily. "That's why I'm asking you directly. I want to know if we want the same thing." "What do you want?" "You," he said, as simple as that. Not as a speech, not as a declaration, just a fact he had organized and was presenting cleanly, properly, for longer than either of us can see the end of. "I want the kind of thing where we know each other's emergency contacts." I breathed carefully. The lamp behind him made a soft halo around the edges of his shoulder. "I want that," I said. "Yes." He exhaled, a small sound quick the release of something he had been holding. And that exhale told me something about what the question had cost him, how much he had cared about the answer, in a way that his steadiness during the asking had not shown me. We sat with it for a moment. Then Claus headbutted Oliver's chin with total imperviousness to the emotional weight of the occasion, and Oliver laughed, and I laughed, and the Sunday afternoon continued. That was 4 months before March, before the suppressant failure, before the bathroom floor. My suppressants had been restored, my dosage was correct. The heat I had experienced in March had been managed, contained, addressed, except, as my doctor gently explained when I called her with what I thought was a routine check-in, apparently not entirely contained. "These things happen," she said, with a compassion that I understood was genuine and that I also could not fully process at the current moment. Especially with batch inconsistency combined with a high proximity alpha, the probability was low. "I know the probability was low," I said. "I teach myself probability. I love probability." "Mr. Small, give me a minute." She gave me a minute. I took 4. The test said what the test said. I picked it up, set it down, picked it up again. Claus came in, assessed the situation with the comprehensive indifference of a creature who had never once concerned himself with biological complexity, and sat on my feet. I sat down on the bathroom floor beside him. I ran through every feeling I had, systematically, because that was how I did things. There was fear, clean and specific, the fear of the unplanned, the fear of change that hadn't been scheduled. There was something that was almost anger. At the pharmacy, at the batch inconsistency, at the particular way that Omega biology remained, something that could be disrupted by forces outside careful personal management. There was the overwhelming strangeness of it, the fact of a thing existing inside me that had not been there a month ago. And then, beneath all of it, something quieter, something I had to be still to hear. Something that had a shape like want. I thought about Oliver. I thought about his hands on my face. I thought about the name plaque he moved to the left of center every day for a man who was gone. I thought about 8 months of being in love without saying so because the timing seemed like it needed to be right. I thought about emergency contacts. I thought about the way he said my name, not often, but precisely, at the moments when it mattered. I thought about Sunday afternoons and 8-hour stock and the rain in the park and a shared cab and a seam I kept not finding. Then I picked up my phone and called him. He picked up on the second ring, which he always did. "Mario. I need you to come over," I said. "There's something I need to tell you in person." A very brief pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 16. I had intended to lead up to it. I had a whole sequence planned. Context, then the disclosure, then the data, then a clear statement of my own feelings and questions and where I stood. I was very good at sequencing. What actually happened was that he came through the door and took one look at my face and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Nothing is wrong exactly," which was true and insufficient. And he crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hands on my face in that precise, careful way. And I looked at him and said, "I'm pregnant." The world did not stop. That is not what happened. What happened was that Oliver Snyder, strategic-led alpha, the person I had filed a formal complaint against, the person who had been in love with me for 8 months before saying so, the person who moved a dead man's name plaque to the left of center because it mattered, stood very still for exactly 5 seconds, and then his face did something I had never seen it do before and could not, if called upon, fully describe. It was not shock, though there was shock in it. It was not fear, though I would have understood fear. It was something open and undefended, something that reorganized his whole expression from the inside. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I repeated. "That's your response. That's the beginning of my response." He didn't move his hands from my face. "Are you all right?" "Physically, medically, yes." I held his gaze. "Emotionally, I am in the process of significant recalibration." "What do you need?" I had expected a lot of things. Questions about timing, about plans, about, practically speaking, there were 1,000 things to work through, and I had already begun a preliminary mental list. I had not expected the first words out of his mouth to be about what I needed. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I just found out." "Okay." He moved, finally, and sat us both down on the sofa, which was an improvement over the hallway where we had apparently been standing this whole time. Claus immediately appeared from wherever he had been and settled between us with regal confidence. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking this is not what I planned." "No, I'm thinking the probability was genuinely very low." "I know. I'm thinking that I love you." I said it plainly, the way I always tried to say true things, and I watched it land in him like it always did, like it mattered, like it was being filed somewhere important. "And I'm thinking that I don't know what the right next step is yet, and I need to know that whatever I decide, you're going to be someone I can talk to about it, honestly." He turned to face me fully. "Mario, listen to me. Whatever you decide, I will support it completely. I have opinions. I have feelings about this, and I will tell you those things when you ask for them, and I will not put them ahead of what you need to figure out first, okay? I looked at him for a long moment. What are your feelings, I asked, about this? He was quiet for a moment, and then, I want to be a father, if you're willing, if you want that. I want to build something with you. I've wanted that for months, before I knew about any of this, and I want to be part of this, whatever this becomes. He held my gaze carefully. But those are my feelings, and this is your body, and those two things are not the same level of weight in this decision. The preliminary mental list dissolved. Something tighter in me loosened, and I leaned back against the sofa and breathed. I want this, I said, quietly, not to the room, to him. I didn't know that until just now, when you said what you said, but I want this. Claus headbutted my hand imperiously, as though the emotional arc of the conversation had gone on long enough, and he required acknowledgement. Claus wants a sibling, I said. Claus wants food, Oliver said. Those are not the same thing. And somehow, in the midst of the most significant conversation of my adult life, I laughed again. People at work found out gradually. In the way that things found out gradually when you work in an open-plan office and two people who are not subtle about being precise about everything are suddenly very precise about not walking in together in the mornings. Priya found out first because Priya had been watching us since before we started watching each other, and her only response was a long-considered nod and the words, "I'm going to need you to confirm that you, Mario Small, who filed a formal HR complaint against this man, are now carrying his child." That is an accurate summary of events. I just want the record to reflect, she said, that I said nothing that day in the office. I had opinions. I kept them. I would like credit for this. Noted, I said, credit given. Oliver's response to the general office awareness was characteristically his. He didn't announce anything, but he stopped pretending there was nothing to notice, and when someone in his division made a comment, one of those comments, the kind that is masquerading as a question, his response was brief and unambiguous, and the topic did not come up again. There was a morning in the 7th month when I was sitting at my desk with the particular mixture of physical awareness and unrelenting professional focus that had characterized the entire pregnancy, and he appeared beside me with my coffee and set it down at my elbow in the exact same way he had months before, except this time when I looked up, he was already looking at me. I keep thinking, he said, quietly, about the mediation. What about it? You walked in with 3 pages of notes and a phone recording and a proposed resolution more coherent than anything legal would have produced. He sat down in Priya's empty chair. I had been dreading that meeting for 4 days. My assistant kept asking if I wanted to bring someone from the legal team, and I kept saying no because I thought whoever had written that complaint was someone worth sitting across from personally. I looked at him. And I was right. He said it simply. I knew in that room. Not clearly yet. It took me months to understand what I was feeling, but I knew you were someone I needed to pay attention to. That was the day I updated the file, I said. Revised the initial assessment. What was the new one? I thought about it. The mediation, the meeting rooms, the lobby in March, the kitchen, the bathroom floor, now. Everything in between. Everything still ahead, still becoming. Complicated, I said. Careful, genuinely good. I looked at him, irritatingly difficult to stay angry at. He smiled. The full one. The unguarded one I had first seen in a conference room over a project and cake. And it did the same thing it always did, which was to rearrange something in my chest that had apparently decided it was his to rearrange. I'm sorry about the initial proposal, he said. For what it's worth, 7 months later and not for the first time. You've apologized sufficiently. I'll keep apologizing until it feels proportionate. It feels proportionate. A pause. Though the HR department will probably appreciate the continued commitment to workplace equity messaging. He laughed. Quiet, genuine, the version I kept for myself. And we sat in the ordinary morning of the office, in the work that continued, because work continued, in the ordinary, extraordinary middle of something neither of us had planned. Our son was born on a morning in October. I remember it in fragments, the way intense experiences tend to present themselves afterward, not as a sequence, but as a collection of vivid stills. The hospital room. Oliver's hand, which I was holding with a grip I would later feel slightly embarrassed about, and he would not let me feel embarrassed about. The specific quality of his voice when he spoke to me between contractions, steady and low, not false comfort, but real presence, saying, you're doing it, I'm right here. In the months between the bathroom floor and October, we had done what we always did, we worked through it. Not without difficulty, not without the arguments that come when two very structured people discover they have structured things differently in their heads, and must now reconcile the structures. There was a conversation about names that lasted 3 evenings. There was a conversation about the apartment, mine, his a new one, that required a spreadsheet, and eventually the spreadsheet's abandonment in favor of the simpler question of where we actually wanted to be, which turned out to be the same place. There were conversations about what pregnancy meant for my work, and those I handled with the same precise fierceness I brought to everything, and Oliver supported every position I took without needing me to soften it first. He moved in. Not in a single dramatic gesture, boxes and furniture and a weekend, but gradually in the way that things settle. A spare key made a drawer opened. A second coffee mug that was always his appearing on the shelf beside mine. Claus assessed him over a period of several weeks and rendered a verdict in the form of a nightly occupation of his side of the bed, which Oliver accepted with equanimity. There were nights when I couldn't sleep. 7th month, the physical discomfort of it, the body becoming a place with new demands and new architecture, and he would be awake beside me. Not because I woke him, but because he always woke when I did, which I had not asked for and had not expected and was not going to admit moved me as much as it did. We lay in the dark and talked about small things. The project data that continued to generate questions even in its aftermath. The facilities team who kept centering the name Plaque. A cooking podcast I had become unreasonably invested in his attempts to master pasta from scratch, which were improving but had not yet reached what I considered a professional standard. We talked about the future in the abstract way that people talk about it when it is arriving too fast to fully imagine. The things we wanted to give, the things we wanted to protect, the kind of people we hoped we were enough to be. What if I'm not good at it? He said once, quietly, at 2 in the morning in October, when the world outside was beginning to show its first cold and the end of waiting was very close. I turned to look at him. He was on his back, looking at the ceiling, with the particular tension of someone holding a worry they have not said aloud until now. At being a father, I said. I don't have a benchmark, he said. My own father was good, but absent, present enough, but not the kind of present I want to be. And I've spent my entire adult life in professional environments where I knew how to measure whether I was doing well. There are no metrics for this. I looked at him for a moment. Outside, the city hummed. You moved a dead man's name plaque back to the left every morning, I said, for years because it mattered to you. You remembered the name of an analyst who corrected you once, a decade ago, because she was right and you thought that deserved to be remembered. I turned to face the ceiling as well. You have been learning my coffee order since October of last year, and you've never gotten it wrong once. Not because I told you to, because you were paying attention. He was quiet. You're already good at it, I said. You just haven't had the specific domain yet. Another quiet. Then, low, thank you. I'm not going to keep thanking me. I know. His hand found mine in the dark. I know. The sound our son made, the particular, indescribable weight of him. Oliver held him first. This was not planned or negotiated. It simply happened, the way some things happened between us now, without needing to be argued over. He held him the way he held everything that mattered. Carefully, completely, like he had already decided this was the most important thing in the room. And then he looked at me over our son's head with an expression I had no classification for, that I still have no classification for, that belonged to no category I had built. There were tears on his face. He did not appear to notice. He was looking at me the way he had looked at me in the mediation, in the project meetings, in the rain, in the park, in the kitchen, on the bathroom floor, with the full and complete attention of someone who has decided you are worth attending to and has not since revised that decision. I named him Elliot. Oliver agreed without hesitation and then said he had the same name in mind for the last 3 months and had been waiting to mention it, which was so entirely him that I laughed until I cried. Or cried until I laughed, or some combination of both that October morning. Elliot Oliver Small. His name in the Register of Important Things, filed under permanent. The complaint file is still in the HR system. Diane with her reading glasses and silver hair mentioned it to me once in the elevator. Mentioned it with the particular warmth of someone who has seen a great many things and has calibrated appropriately. Which ones to find delightful? It was a very thorough complaint, she said. I document things carefully, I said. That you do, Mr. Small. A pause as the elevator rose. Congratulations, by the way. I heard he arrived safely. He did, thank you. The doors opened. I walked out, down the hallway, back to my desk where the coffee was exactly right and the work was waiting, and Priya was already watching me approach with the expression of someone who is going to demand details. Oliver texted at 9:43. A photo. Elliot asleep on his chest, one tiny hand curled against the fabric of his shirt. Beneath it, he misses the cat already. I looked at it for a moment. Then I typed back, the cat does not miss him. The cat is a consummate professional. SES, and then I'll be home by 6. SES, I love you. SE. His response was immediate, the way it always was when it mattered. I know, I love you, drive safe. I set my phone face down on my desk. Outside, the city went about its ordinary morning. People and light and the movement of things that did not know or care about. Mediation sessions, or batch inconsistencies, or updated files, or the specific weight of a sleeping child on a chest. I knew. I cared. I held it all. I opened my laptop and began to work. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.